Why unleavened bread matters in the Bible. Have you ever noticed that some of the deepest truths in the Bible are hidden inside the simplest things? Not thunder from heaven, not fire on a mountain, not a sea dividing in two. Sometimes it is bread, just bread. And yet, Scripture returns to it again and again, as though something astonishing were hidden inside it. Not just any bread, unleavened bread. Bread without yeast. Bread that did not rise. Bread that looks plain, ordinary, almost too ordinary to matter. And that is exactly why so many people miss it. Because the Bible often hides its greatest revelations inside the most familiar signs. We rush toward what feels dramatic and spectacular, while God keeps teaching through what appears quiet, simple, and almost easy to overlook. But once you understand why unleavened bread matters, you begin to see that this is not just a detail about ancient food. It is a symbol of deliverance, memory, purity, urgency, and transformation. It is one of the Bible's most powerful ways of showing what redemption feels like when God breaks into history. So today, we are going to slow down and look carefully at this symbol. Because unleavened bread is not minor at all. It is memory made edible. It is theology you can touch. It is history pressed into a sign. And once you see what it means, you will never read those passages the same way again. To understand why unleavened bread matters, we have to go back to one of the most dramatic moments in the Old Testament, the night of deliverance from Egypt. Israel had lived under oppression, not just inconvenience, not just social discomfort, oppression. Their bodies were used. Their freedom was shattered. Their future was controlled by a power that did not fear God and did not love justice. And in biblical memory, Egypt becomes more than a nation on a map. It becomes a symbol of bondage, of life trapped under a power it cannot overcome by itself. Then God intervenes, not as an idea, not as a distant comfort, not as a vague spiritual feeling. He intervenes in history. He judges. He distinguishes. He acts. He delivers. The night of Passover is one of the great turning points in Scripture because it is the night when slavery begins to break. And on that night, unleavened bread appears not as a random dietary detail, but as part of the very shape of salvation itself. Why unleavened? Because there was no time. That detail is crucial. This was not the bread of slow preparation. It was not the bread of ordinary routine. It was not the bread of a settled people, safe and comfortable in their homes. It was the bread of urgency. The people were leaving. God's moment had come. Deliverance was moving. History was turning. And when God opens the door out of bondage, hesitation becomes dangerous. That is why the dough was not left to rise. This is one of the first great meanings of unleavened bread in biblical theology. It is the bread of decisive departure. The bread itself becomes a witness that God moved suddenly, a witness that bondage was not to be negotiated with forever, a witness that salvation was not merely an idea to admire, but an act to respond to. And that matters more than many people realize. Because human beings often delay liberation. Even when the door opens, we hesitate. We calculate. We negotiate with old chains. We become attached to familiar forms of suffering. We tell ourselves that one more day in Egypt is manageable. One more compromise is tolerable. One more delay is harmless. But Passover does not feel like that. Passover feels like movement, decision.
To forget grace is to become proud. To forget rescue is to imagine that you saved yourself. So God gives Israel a memorial meal. And in that meal, unleavened bread says, never forget the speed, the seriousness, and the reality of your deliverance. You were not always free. You were not always safe. You were not always your own. God brought you out. And He brought you out in such a way that even your bread had to remember it. Think about how beautiful that is. God does not place memory only in books. He places memory in meals. He places theology in the body. He gives truth a taste. That tells us something profound about biblical faith. The Bible is not interested in detached spirituality. It does not imagine human beings as minds floating above material life. The God of Scripture teaches through matter, through symbols, through touch, through seasons, through food, through festivals, through the repeated patterns of embodied life. So unleavened bread is not trivial. It is theology you can chew. And now we go deeper still. Because later in Scripture, leaven begins to take on symbolic force. Leaven spreads. A small amount affects the whole lump. Its power is quiet, hidden, gradual, permeating. That is why leaven becomes such a potent biblical image. Something small can influence everything. Something nearly invisible can shape the whole. What enters the dough does not remain isolated. It works its way through all of it. This symbolism can be used positively in some contexts. But when biblical writers speak about leaven in connection with sin, hypocrisy, malice, corruption, or false influence, the image becomes morally charged. And this is where unleavened bread acquires another layer of meaning. It becomes not only the bread of haste, but the bread of separation from corruption. This becomes especially clear in the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 7 and 8, Paul says, "Clean out the old leaven, so that you may be a new batch, as you really are unleavened. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth." That is a breathtaking move. Paul is not merely commenting on an old ritual. He is rereading it spiritually and morally. In other words, the Exodus pattern becomes a pattern for the believer's life. You were brought out, so leave behind what belongs to the old house of bondage. You were rescued, so do not preserve Egypt in your heart. You crossed into a new condition, so stop feeding what corrupts the whole inner life. That is what makes unleavened bread so powerful in theology. It stands between history and transformation. It remembers what God did, and it demands that the redeemed life look different. This is the point where biblical faith becomes deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. Because many people want deliverance without change. They want rescue from judgment, but not purification of the heart. They want salvation from bondage, but not the death of old loyalties. They want the language of redemption, but not the discipline of becoming new. Unleavened bread resists that illusion. It says that when God brings you out, something old must go. Not because holiness is a cruel burden, but because freedom cannot fully flourish while corruption remains cherished. That is why the old leaven becomes such a strong image. It is not always loud evil. Sometimes it is tolerated influence, hidden compromise, quiet decay. The thing you excuse because it seems small, even though it is slowly shaping everything. And the biblical imagination is extraordinarily honest about this. What spreads in secret eventually defines the whole life. So unleavened bread becomes the sign of a people called to sincerity, purity, and truthfulness before God. Now let us move to the Gospels. Because if all of this remained only in Exodus, it would already be rich. But it does not remain there. The symbol travels. The feast remains alive. The memory continues. And then Jesus steps into that world. The Gospels do not present Jesus in a symbolic vacuum. He comes into a people already shaped by Passover, covenant memory, feast rhythms, temple expectation, sacrificial language, and sacred time. That means when the Gospel writers mention Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, they are not adding random color to the story. They are activating a whole world of meaning. The Last Supper does not happen in a meaningless frame. The approach of Jesus' passion does not unfold in neutral time. The feast context matters. It matters because the story of Israel's old deliverance becomes the stage on which a greater revelation is unfolding. The people once remembered being brought out of Egypt. Now the gospel begins to reveal a redemption even deeper than political slavery, a liberation reaching into sin, death, guilt, estrangement, and the inner captivity of the human condition. And so the symbol deepens. Unleavened bread had once remembered the haste of departure. Now it stands at the threshold of the passion of Christ. It belongs to the final meal. It belongs to the transition. It belongs to the crossing from one covenantal moment into another. This is why the New Testament never treats these feast settings as irrelevant leftovers from Judaism. They are alive with meaning. Jesus does not enter history disconnected from them. He enters through them, within them, fulfilling and transforming them. And that should affect the way we read the Bible. Because too often, people read the Old Testament as though it is merely background material, and the New Testament as though it appears out of nowhere. But the Gospels themselves do not allow that shallow reading. Their world is already charged with symbols, and Jesus' words and actions often intensify rather than erase those earlier meanings. Unleavened bread is one of those meanings. It still whispers urgency. It still remembers deliverance. It still calls for separation from corruption. It still asks what kind of life should follow rescue. And that brings the symbol directly into our world. Because this is not only about Israel in Egypt. It is not only about Paul's churches. It is not only about liturgical memory in the first century. It is about us. How many people say they want freedom while keeping affection for what ruins them? How many people celebrate grace while quietly feeding old corruption? How many admire redemption as a doctrine, but resist it as a reordering of life? How many want God to open the sea, but do not want to leave Egypt behind? That is why this ancient bread is still dangerous, because it exposes the difference between remembering salvation and living as the saved. To eat unleavened bread in the biblical imagination is to stand inside a truth. God has acted.
Therefore, you cannot remain exactly as you were. A new life must follow deliverance. A new honesty must follow mercy. A new sincerity must follow rescue. A new separation from corruption must follow the call of God. This does not mean perfection. It does not mean spiritual pride. It does not mean pretending that the journey is easy. Israel left Egypt quickly, but the wilderness journey was long. And that too is part of the realism of Scripture. Deliverance may begin decisively, but formation still takes time. Bondage may be broken in one great act of God, yet the inner habits of slavery do not disappear without struggle. That is important for listeners who feel torn between hope and weakness. Unleavened bread is not telling you that the redeemed never struggle. It is telling you that they now belong to a different direction. They are leaving. They are no longer making peace with Egypt as their final home. They are learning to live as people who have been acted upon by grace. And that may be the deepest reason this symbol matters. It holds together three realities at once. Memory. God has brought us out. Purity. The old corruption must not be cherished. Transition. We are now on the move toward a new life. That is not small theology. That is massive theology hidden in ordinary bread. So the next time you hear about unleavened bread in Scripture, do not reduce it to a dietary detail. Hear the thunder inside it. Hear the speed of deliverance. Hear the refusal to delay when God opens the way. Hear the call to remember what bondage felt like. Hear the command to leave corruption behind. Hear the beginning of a new life shaped by sincerity and truth. Because the Bible does not waste symbols. And when it repeats one, it is inviting you to linger there until the deeper meaning begins to burn. In the next chapter, we move deeper into that burning meaning by entering the event that made unleavened bread unforgettable in the first place: Passover. Not just as an ancient Jewish feast, but as one of the great theological foundations of the Bible. A night of judgment and mercy. A night of blood and deliverance. A night when history changed under the weight of God's intervention. And once we see Passover clearly, we will understand even more deeply why this simple bread was never simple at all.